In 2002, I was in Afghanistan covering the war. I was with a CBC television crew. There were 3 of us. And we were trying to tell the story that wasn't getting much attention. We soon discovered why. We wanted to expose the role of Afghanistan's notorious warlords. President George W. Bush didn't want many U.S. troops on the ground to fight the war, so he had engaged Afghanistan's mercenaries to do the job for him. These were ruthless men with their own standing armies, and especially one was particularly awful, a militia leader from the north by the name of General Rashid Dostum. We learned that General Dostum had conducted a massacre of prisoners of war, and it seemed likely that the United States had been involved. By the way, this is something the International Criminal Court now wants to investigate. This is a very good and a very important story, except for one thing. No one would talk. They were afraid of the warlords, with good reason. But we needed a source, someone who could take us into the heart of the matter. And then we met Asad Arabwal. Asad is what we call in the business a get, a solid and reliable source. He had a vested interest, but it was to expose to the light of day the dangers of the warlord influence. He wanted no money. In fact, another TV crew had lost him as a source when they offered to pay him. "My words are not for sale," he told us. Asad had worked with General Dostum and disliked him intensely, but wanted only that the warlord should be brought to justice. Asad and his testimony became the backbone of our documentary. He took us into the heart of Dostum territory. He introduced us to people. He got us access. We also met and filmed Asad's family. And I didn't know until years later, but he saved our lives. He thwarted a plot to have us kidnapped. I kept in touch with Asad after we left Afghanistan, mostly through his lovely daughter, Ruby, who was a teenager at the time. I returned a few years later in 2006 to do a follow-up. Asad said many of the same things, but nothing had changed in Afghanistan. General Dostum was more powerful than ever. What Asad didn't tell me was that after the first documentary, General Dostum threatened to kill him. And Asad also didn't tell me that after our second interview, Rashid Dostum sent his death squads. General Dostum gave Asad the option of leaving Afghanistan, taking his family and going into exile. But if he failed to do that immediately, leaving everything behind, it would be certain death for him and for his sons. Almost by chance, I found Asad living in exile in Pakistan, and I learned the whole story. His life was in ruins. He was impoverished, fearing for his life. His family had no future. Why had he agreed to talk to me, especially the second time? What compelled him? He must have known it was so dangerous. I asked him these questions. He told me that if he had not spoken out against the warlord, against injustice, he would never be able to look into the eyes of his children again. I decided at that moment that I was going to get him out of the mess that I had put him in. I didn't realize that it would take 9 years of almost daily effort before I was able to get Asad, his family, his wife, 5 children, to safety here in Canada. In the course of those years, I had much time to consider what happens when you cross the line and get involved. My personal engagement with his life and family created all kinds of dilemmas for me. As it turned out, the Arabwals became a small part of an international crisis for refugees. Since 2010, we have witnessed the biggest migration of humanity since the Second World War. I had to cover that story for the CBC. It was and is a big story. And in particular, as the host of As It Happens, I was trying to hold the Canadian government to account for failing to live up to its obligations to refugees. This was a very tight line to walk. Trying to maneuver through the complex world of refugee policy and the obstacles of the government in order to help the Aryabols while holding the Canadian government to account. My view was that helping the family was an extension of my obligations as a reporter. We're told not to endanger the lives of others or ourselves, and this seemed a logical extension of that principle, or at least I convinced myself of that. But I always knew I was in murky territory, especially during some testy exchanges with Canada's ministers in charge of the refugee portfolio, in particular, Jason Kenney and Christopher Alexander. All of this has become the subject of a book I've recently published called All We Leave Behind, A Reporter's Journey into the Lives of Others. To say the least, my involvement with Asad's family turned my world upside down, not only because I became the lifeline for 7 people, none of whom I knew all that well, but also because it challenged all my assumptions about my work as a journalist. There was, and is, no doubt in my mind that I was obliged to do anything possible to help rescue the Aryabol family. But I also felt my strong obligation to expose the weaknesses of the Canadian and international refugee systems. On the one hand, there was always the risk that I might be in a conflict of interest. But on the other hand, I believed that my journalism was more informed because I had a front row seat on the refugee selection process. When Minister Chris Alexander said the refugees who were coming to Canada were in the pipe, I knew the pipe was the width of a drinking straw, and it was sometimes sealed altogether. When the government said it had UN security and health checks on the go for refugees, I knew how corrupt the process was, how fraught with bribes and graft, and there was even the possible role of Russian organized crime in the process. This knowledge informed my journalism, but at the cost of a potential conflict. Was I right or was I wrong to get so involved?